On here. Okay, well, welcome everybody to Conditioning, the what, the why, and the how with myself, Brendan Rear, Kevin Carr, and Stephen Bigelow.
Steven, yes.
I put Stephen in there. I
I
figured that
love
you
it.
would appreciate
That is my
that.
name.
That is your name. Oh, go figure. Use the Q&A box. So there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can ask all your questions there and try to keep them relevant to the current discussion. Don't use the chat box. Don't send us emails. Don't send us text messages, please. Just keep it all in one area. It makes it way simpler for us to follow along and answer. And then we can also answer we can answer and type those answers in for you while there's dead time while one of us is talking. There was pre-reading. There were 5 articles that we sent out earlier. If you didn't get to read them, that's fine. I suggest reading them afterwards when you do have the time to do so. The reason why we sent those was just to kind of set the platform to give you an idea of what we were going to be speaking about today and also maybe answer some of those questions. So we had 550 registrations, which means we had 550 questions to answer. And I'm hopeful that some of those articles answer some of those. And then also the next part, each of us are going to give our thoughts on what, why, and how of both programming. And Kevin and Steve will be talking more about programming. I'll be talking more about the coaching piece. And I'm hopeful that that will answer at least 80% of those questions. I've included about 15, maybe 20 questions for us to answer additionally after this if we have time. If you have to leave early, totally cool. Everyone who's registered on this event will get a post email with a recording of this and a PDF of these slides. So even if you miss it, you can watch it again later. So that's it. That's all I got. We have how many people on here right now? We'll see. We got 145 on here right now. Anything you two want to add before we start?
No, that was brilliant.
All right, cool. Kevin, I'm actually going to have you start since you have the least amount of slides. And yours are just an overarching, I think, philosophy.
Yeah, I want to just be simple, assuming the rest will be Q&A. So
You have less slides than I do? Wow.
I literally have 2.
Yeah, I have the most slides, so I'm going to do the most box talking. But Kevin, you can start, and then I think I'll go after you, and then Steve, you'll go after me since you have more stuff on programming.
Okay, cool. You want to stop sharing your screen so I can share mine?
Yeah. There we go. All you.
All right. There we go. All right. So, yeah, I didn't want to do a whole PowerPoint presentation, but just some overarching themes that I know will probably go well with what Steve is going to talk about and what Brendan is going to talk about, and then hopefully can lead us into the principles and the philosophies we want to think about when we're going through the Q&A. And I think often when you have people think about conditioning, they always think about the number one goal is to make people tired or make people work really hard. But realize, especially when we're working with athletes, I love the Dan John quote, and like always coming back to a real simple line, which is, the goal is to keep the goal, right? And the number one thing we want to do is try to make these athletes perform better and stay healthier in their sport. We're not trying to make them the best in the gym. We're not trying to make them work the hardest in the gym. We want to make sure that everything they do translates to their sport. And the more and more I listen to someone like Tony Holler, who's someone when he first came in to NBSC and spoke to us, like if you looked around the staff and when he was telling everyone not to lift weights and that all you had to do is sprint, you'd think that like we were all going to like burn him at the stake for saying that, like myself included. But the more you think about it and the more we see the results of all the sprint work we've done in NBSC, like the more I think that he's kind of on the right path, right? And I heard him say something the other day on a podcast where he said, like, do we want to make them tired or do we want to make them better? And do we want race horses or do we want workhorses, right? It's really easy to take these athletes or even these Gen Pop clients when they come into us and build a ton of work capacity and make them really tired and have them do a ton of work. But with the athletes specifically, we really want to make sure that we're trying to make them faster. And the goal isn't always to make them tired in training. I think often coaches think to make sure people don't get tired in training, they think you have to make sure that they don't get tired in their sport, you should try to make them tired in training. And I actually think it's the opposite of that. I think the best way to make sure that people don't get tired in their sport is to not excessively gas them when they're in there training with us. So keeping the quality high, and then always trying to keep an eye on what is the goal of our energy systems and what is the adaptation we're trying to get. And I think you'll see when you look at Steve's programming piece that's really the main focus of what we do especially when we're working with our athletes. And just using this this graphic from my energy systems presentation, I think that when you're working with real singular sports, so whether way on the left on the top of that curve here, where you see sports where the rate of energy production is really high and the duration is really low, things like weightlifting or powerlifting or the throws and jumps in track and field, versus all the way on the right where you see endurance-based sports like marathon or long distance running. Those are much simpler endeavors, right? We were talking about our staff meeting the other day that we had at NBSC, where we had that bobsled coach come and talk, and it was really interesting to hear because of how singular those training goals were, to have his team train for elite bobsled competition because it's so unique, right? Whereas the majority of the strength and conditioning coaches, the people who are probably in this talk and are working, whether they're with recreational athletes or with real competitive athletes in high school or college or professional, they're working in this murky area in the middle of team sports where there's no clear answer. Do we want to chase ultimate power? Do we want to chase endurance? All of those sports are somewhere in between. So that's typically why there's so much debate about what is the best practice or what is the best training approach to develop elite, healthy athletes in any of these sports. But I think you always have to go back to asking yourself, what is the most desirable quality in any of those sports? And I still think speed and power ultimately is if you could only pick one adaptation that you want for any of those sports that are listed there, it's going to be speed and power. And I think more often than not, good warm-ups and really complete programs and sports practice in general is going to develop the general aerobic health for most athletes. And that's not always true, maybe coming off injuries or someone who's really out of shape. And when we're talking about general population, there might be a higher need for aerobic work, but the general adaptation we probably want with most of our sporting athletes is high intensity repeat power work. So more towards that left side of the spectrum. And I really just wanted to show those two slides before to kind of steer the framework and steer the direction of the conversation as we go forward from here. Who's up next, Steve or Brendan?
Brendan.
I'll go next. I'll build on this slide here. So if you stop sharing your screen, Kev.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So what I did is I guess a little shameless plug here is I knew Biggs would laugh when I said that. I have a book coming out this summer. And so I've taken my 3 main conditioning rules from that book. So the book has 105 rules, but rule number 29 is no one conditions alone. And this is actually one of my favorite articles that out there in fitness that we have all of the interns read. And it was written by Kevin Neild. I'll have to take a picture of that and send it to him to tell him that I gave him credit for that. So the idea with no one conditions alone is that conditioning is by far the worst part about the whole process. And nobody wants to do that by themselves. So the rule at the gym is if you're an intern and you see somebody who's running a sprint by themselves, you immediately jump in and do it with them. And when you're coaching, if you have a group of 12 people, you either make 4 groups of 3 or you make 2 groups of 6 so that someone is always running with somebody. And you try to pair somebody up with somebody who is a similar speed to them. But we all know, I mean, this is why group training works so well and why people see more success is because when you do things like that together, you overcome and struggle together, people get a lot more out of it. And if you've ever run a sprint with an athlete or an adult, they'll run so much faster if you do it with them. And they're much more encouraged and you build up that relationship. So rule number 29 in the book is no one conditions alone ever. And that's the rule. You never walk away. You never have somebody running against just by themselves. Someone's always doing with them. Even if, say, it's somebody that you're much faster than, you just jog with them and encourage them the entire time. And I think we've probably all been to a marathon where somebody jumps in and starts encouraging the person and they pick it up. So no one ever conditions alone. The next rule is don't forget that everything that you do is conditioning. I think a lot of people forget that when you strength train, when you do power work, when you do mobility work, you are in your aerobic zone. So everybody always asks, like, what should I do for more aerobic work? If you put a heart rate monitor on, and during the first 50 minutes of your workout, if you go mobility, dynamic warm-up, med ball plyo, and strength training, you stay in your aerobic window. So instead of doing more aerobic training, you are aerobically training when you strength train 3 or 4 days a week. And they would call that GPP, general physical preparedness. You are in your aerobic zone. So that means, therefore, true conditioning happens when you go to the aerobic zone. So that's above your 80% of your max heart rate, which Steve will talk about here in a minute, is we're generally doing things for 10 to 15 minutes long, and it's mostly interval training. Because the first 50 minutes of our training program, I encourage everyone to do this experiment on themselves, is wear a heart rate monitor while you work out and watch your heart rate the entire workout, and notice the first 50 minutes when you're strength training and doing warm up and getting ready to train, your heart rate stays in your aerobic zone. So don't forget that everything you do is some sort of conditioning. When we say conditioning, we're talking about anaerobic zone, where we're trying to hit max heart rates, and we're using interval training to do that. And none of our conditioning is ever, over 15 minutes, would you guys say?
Generally, yeah, no. I would say less than, even some, maybe like 12 even.
12, less than 12 minutes of true conditioning, because everything we do before that is conditioning as well. The bucket hierarchy. So let's see if these, they do work. Yeah. So the bucket hierarchy. So Steve, I saw that you have this coming up as well. So I did a presentation for the CFSC. If you are a CFSC, if you go to the CFSC resources, you can watch my filling buckets talk, which I think I did almost 4 years ago now. I created it after I read Coach Boyle's article, Are We Just Bucket Fillers? So as coaches, there's 4 buckets in our world. There's the movement bucket, the strength bucket, the power bucket, and the conditioning bucket. So we're always trying to fill each of those buckets. We don't want to overflow them, right? Overflowing would mean that we're overtraining, and we don't want to have them be underfilled, which means we don't have enough in order to complete whatever it is, task it is, or goal that we want. But there's a hierarchy too. So you have to first move well and then move often, which is the functional movement screen philosophy. Because if you don't move well, like if this is my shoulder range of motion, I'm going to be a terrible swimmer no matter what I do. Because if I can't get full shoulder flexion and thoracic extension, it doesn't even matter. I'm going to be a bad swimmer. Swim all you want. You will not be good because you can't get in the position that you need to get into. So next would come strength. So never put strength on top of dysfunction. So if these were my shoulders, I wouldn't want to be pressing overhead. That would be increasing the likeliness of injury or the dysfunction. And then power is just strength expressed quickly. And you need strength in order to absorb the force. Because if I couldn't absorb the force, the body's not going to let you be powerful. I've never seen a weak, powerful person. They don't exist. You can't be weak and powerful because you need to be able to absorb the force. So I always tell my athletes and clients that if you were to catch a water balloon or an egg, you would accept the water balloon or egg so it didn't break. That's what strength training does. It teaches you how to accept your body. And then finally, conditioning is you don't get fit by running. You need to be fit to run. So it's not a great way to get fit is couch to 5K leads 60% of people who start a running program get injured. And so because they don't move well, they don't have the strength in order to absorb the ground, and they don't have the power to produce force. And then conditioning is just your ability to produce power over multiple times for a certain duration. So do you want LeBron James jumping a 40-inch vertical in the first quarter, or do you want him to be able to do it all 4 quarters? Great, you can do it in the first half, but if you can't do it in the second half, you lose the game. So there's a bucket hierarchy that we have to think about as well. One of my pet peeves is this hands on your head stuff. right? You don't want to look soft, put your hands on your head. We know that it's hands on your knees. So if we look at Postural Restoration Institute, so I wanted to include a little breathing in here as well, because we got a bunch of questions about that. PRI calls it the zone of apposition, which basically just means your rib cage and pelvis are stacked on top of each other. So you can see in the middle picture here, your rib cage and pelvis are stacked. So therefore, hands on your knees, I'll show a picture with this on the next slide, equals better rib cage position, which means you recover quicker than the person who puts their hand on their head, which puts them into extension, which means those pumps in your neck and your shoulders can't work to get in air. So you actually recover less when you put your hands on your head, even though you look tough, but you don't recover as fast. So you can see here, what does every single athlete do after they finish a sprint? They round their spine, they lay on the ground, they go hands on their knees, because we intuitively know this is the best way to take in air and recover. So things like quadruped breathing, 90-90 breathing on your back are that position. So teaching people how to breathe as part of their conditioning program can also be important to recovery, which is also known as your aerobic zone. So coaching breathing strategies is one of my other rules. So we want to think of breathing as it's context dependent. So there's no one proper way to breathe. No one would ever deadlift 500 pounds by going and relaxing into the deadlift. You hold your breath. The Valsalva maneuver is a wonderful maneuver for picking up heavy things. The Valsalva maneuver is a terrible way to tie your shoes and a terrible way to sleep. People sleep like they just ran a 400-meter sprint. It's called sleep apnea. People who sleep with their mouths open and extension, it's like they're running in their sleep. You should know when to rest. So rest and digest. So nice, easy breathing in the nose, out the mouth. So that's all your mobility work. And when you condition, you want to keep that nice, natural breathing for as long as you possibly can before you start going mouth breathing. So if you're mouth breathing after doing a set of squats, that's not good. That's conditioning that we need to work on. You should be mouth breathing after you've run 10 really difficult sprints. So we have breathing, we have no one ever conditions alone. And then we have the hierarchy. So like Kevin said, that power is more important, because if you don't have power, if you don't have engine or you don't have horsepower, you don't even get on the field. So great, you can run forever, but if you're not fast and you don't throw hard and you don't jump high, you don't even get to play the game. So power has to come first. And I love the analogy of, I think I've taken this from Charlie Weingroff. Kev, you might remember his article, Training the On and the Off.
Mm-hmm.
So aerobic is the size of your gas tank. Capacity, or your anaerobic threshold, so where you start to switch from aerobic to anaerobic, is miles per gallon, or how efficient you are. And then anaerobic power is how much horsepower you have. So I just made up some examples here. So someone has 500 horsepower, but they get 50 miles per gallon, but their gas tank is only 6-gallon gas tank. So they're explosive, they're efficient, but they can't make all 4 quarters of the second half. So if you have a basketball player or a soccer player, great, you're really powerful, but you don't last long enough to even play the whole game. So that person, we need to fill the aerobic bucket. So that means more walks, more bike rides, more metabolic conditioning, functional training. Somebody might have a 350 horsepower engine, but they have terrible efficiency. They only get 10 miles per gallon. So they start switching to anaerobic way earlier than everybody else. Great, you have a good aerobic base, you have decent power, but you're terribly inefficient. So that's the person that we need to train interval training. So they need to train what we would call the on, whereas aerobic training is the off. So can you produce power multiple times in a row for a certain duration? And then finally, we'd have somebody with a 90 horsepower engine. They get 40 miles per gallon and they have a 100-gallon gas tank. They have a monster gas tank, but they have no speed. So guess what? You're going to take forever to run that marathon. So great, you're probably good in endurance sports and you can last forever, but instead of running your marathon in 3 hours, you run it in 6 because you got a great gas tank, but you don't have any horsepower to put behind the gas tank. So I like using that analogy because people get really, really lost on, I mean, if you read Joel Jamieson's book, which I highly recommend, which I'll put in the resources, he has alactic power, alactic capacity, anaerobic power, anaerobic capacity, aerobic power, aerobic capacity. And it's like, well, okay, what the hell am I training here? Remember, everything is conditioning. You're always working on each of those buckets. It's just how much are you going to be working on those buckets, which, Steve, you'll be going into next. So I don't know if there's anything you two want to add to that, or Steve, you want to go into the how?
Yeah, I'll go into it. I mean, there'll be some repetitive stuff, but that's okay. If you unshare, I can open mine.
Yeah, you're good.
All right, so just to add to what Brendan and Kevin had said, let's talk a little bit more specifics about what we would do from an athlete performance conditioning standpoint. Like I said, we'll go over why, how, what. And one other thing you need to think about is who. So we always say why, how, and what, but who are you training? And is this a young athlete? Is this a older person? Is this a professional athlete? Is this a younger professional athlete or an older professional athlete? There's some different questions you need to ask on the who spectrum before you can decide what you're going to do from a training modality. We'll talk about bucket filling again, overcomplicating filling the buckets. As mentioned, sport age specificity, theoretical versus practical. So we all know that a lot of people love to know a lot of things, but half the time they can't apply what they know because their situation is limited because of equipment. Maybe it's space. Maybe you're in a cold weather climate and you can't get outside and run and you want to do a run test. So you always have to be thinking about logistical considerations. And then we'll talk about a real basic conditioning outline you can use for what we use for our athletes in our specific situation at Mike Boyle Strength Conditioning. So as we talked about, do you even need to worry about conditioning your athletes? What performance buckets are already filled? So with us in the private strength conditioning model in the United States, a lot of athletes, and a lot, you could say even more than a lot, most athletes you will train have practice, have sports year round. And with practice and with sports comes a lot of running and a lot of conditioning and a lot of gameplay. So half the time, or more than half the time, when we get athletes in the gym, they don't need any more conditioning. As Brendan said, that bucket, even though it should be the last thing to be filled, is already full and more commonly overflowing. So these athletes would do much better by focusing on the movement bucket, the strength bucket, the power bucket, and that's going to help them increase their game better than the conditioning because they're already getting so much running and so much conditioning in their sport in practice. Second question you need to ask when you're doing an analysis is, who are the best players in the sport? So as Kevin and Brendan both mentioned, most sports, especially the popular sports in the world right now, the best players in those sports are what? They're generally not the players who are in the best shape, but they're the players who are the fastest, who are the most powerful, right? At least in American sports and definitely in soccer. So if you think, well, I'm just going to get this kid in the best shape, well, that might be missing the boat in the sense that, well, to get this athlete the best at their sport, I should probably focus a little bit more on the speed and power aspect of training before thinking about writing a novel with your conditioning. Okay. What does the athlete need? What we're looking for all of our athletes is to have a resting heart rate less than 60 beats per minute. This would show you that they have an adequate aerobic base, another quote, aerobic base, so they can recover from bouts of high intensity exercise quickly. And then in the 1 to 2 minute heart rate recovery from a maximum elevated heart rate, we would look for them to be able to recover 30 beats in 1 minute after exercise and then 50 beats in 2 minutes. So if I do a bike sprint and I get my heart rate up to 190 beats per minute after that bike sprint, hopefully after 1 minute, I can recover to at least 160. And then after 2 minutes, I can recover even more down to 140. Okay. And then we also need to look at, once you have these measurements down, what is the best training modality for that specific athlete or for that specific sport? Do you want it to be specific to the sport? If I'm training a soccer player, they probably are going to have to run if they're at the point where we're going to do some conditioning. However, I'm training a professional soccer player who maybe has been playing for 10 years and he's in his mid-30s and he's had significant injury history, maybe running isn't the best option for that person. I need to look at him from the athlete and decide, hey, maybe he should bike because he doesn't need any more impact than what he's already going to get from when he comes in place. Theory versus practice. So don't overcomplicate training. One thing we love to do as coaches is overcomplicate everything. It really is simple. We want to fit the science to the game. A lot of people, like Brendan just mentioned, in Ultimate MMA Conditioning, you'll read terms like anaerobic power, anaerobic capacity, aerobic power, aerobic capacity, alactic power, alactic capacity, lactic power, lactic capacity. There's a lot of terms, and it can get very complicated. You have to fit the science to the game. You need to watch the sport that your athletes are playing and decide what conditioning is going to work for that sport. Okay, so most of your sports, your big four sports in America now, for example, are going to be intermittent bouts of high intensity exercise with short rest periods. So are you watching the sport to see what the work rest ratios are for individual athletes in the game? Or are you just kind of making up something that you read? You're just getting people tired. You need to think of it more intelligently and fit your conditioning model to the sport that's being played or that you're training your athletes for. 10% rule in monitoring yardage. When you are making conditioning programs, one thing that is very important is making sure that you are not increasing volume too quickly. So generally in between weeks, what we will do is we'll only increase about 10 to 20% of volume of running. And then when we go to a new phase, we might decrease the volume, but increase the intensity, because we don't want to simultaneously increase volume and intensity. Because remember, what's rule number one when training athletes? Do no harm. If we increase volume and intensity at the same time, it just puts the athletes at an unnecessary injury risk. Doesn't mean they will get injured, but we're always trying to be more risk averse. And then short to long. Classic kind of strength and conditioning periodization will tell you want to build a wide base at the bottom of your pyramid with aerobic base and then intensify up. We generally will start with shorter distances and shorter total yardage. And as we progress through training, we're going to add more volume and add more intensity. This works from an injury prevention standpoint. We don't want people to get injured in training. If you start with longer volumes and longer yardage, even if it is at a slower speed and lower intensities, you are putting your athletes at a higher risk for injury just from an overuse standpoint early in a training session, especially when they might be coming off from a season or a period where they haven't even been training in a while. You don't want to throw them into increased workloads. The role of the strength and conditioning coach. What is our role as a strength and conditioning coach? Now, this goes back to buckets. You need to look at what your athlete's doing to make sure that you can program correctly. So Dan Baker has a quote about practice, and he is a rugby strength and conditioning coach, but rugby is very similar energetic demands to soccer, to basketball, to a lot of sports. And most practice and skill and tactical trainings are done at your kind of long, slow distance speeds and heart rates. So if we're training these athletes who are getting more than enough long, slow distance speeds and heart rate in their practice, which they're doing more than they are than training with us, then why would we want to program in more longer, slower distance or lower aerobic based work in our training? Our job, because of what they already do in skill and tactical training, our job is to provide a higher intensity stimulus, a higher intensity aerobic stimulus. So that's what we talk about going down to interval training and maximum aerobic speed. We know that we use a lot of maximum aerobic speed intervals with our bike work, all right? Our running work, we tend to do shuttles, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But with maximum aerobic speed, what we're looking for is if you have an athlete do a 5-minute bike ride test, which is what we do, or a 2-mile test, or you could have them go out for a 1.5 mile run. Pretty much what maximum aerobic speed is the lowest speed at which VO2 max occurs. Or it's the average speed over that 5 or 6 minute test, whatever you do. Our testing and our training, what we're going to do is we're going to program intervals at higher than that speed that they run, or higher than that average speed. Because the research shows that if you train above your maximum aerobic speed, your increases in aerobic power are going to be greater than if you just train at or below that maximum aerobic speed with longer, slower distance or not as higher intensity interval training. So that's what's going to lead most of our aerobic increases. Whereas the anaerobic stuff and anaerobic power is obviously going to be taken care of with our power and our sprint and our lifting training. Okay? And then logistical considerations, as I mentioned. If you want to do a maximum aerobic speed test and you want to have your athletes run a mile, but you only have a 1,000 square foot training space that doesn't even have a strip of turf, and you live in northern Canada, it's going to be really hard to have your athletes go out and run a mile. So you need to think about what you have available to you and then decide what you can program in for training after that. And then this is pretty much how our basic scheme works. So if you think about an off-season conditioning training program, we usually work over a 12-week period. That's a general off-season for most sports. Our basic scheme is going to be phase one. We're going to return to training and accumulate volume. So most of these athletes have just come off a season. They may have taken a few weeks off, but regardless, for the most part, they might not have been in formal training, and they're definitely not at off-season training volumes and intensities. So our phase one is pretty much all built around accumulating volume and preparing athletes for higher intensity training in the later phases of the program, in weeks 4 through 12. Tempo running. So we're working in the sprint motor pattern with tempo running, but it's minimal direction change. It's non-competitive. You're not racing against anyone. You're building adaptation and volume accumulation through weekly volume increases, lower intensity increases, just so we can prepare for later phases when we do introduce harder running, harder bike intervals. Testing. So we are going to test so we can determine athletes' maximum aerobic speed. For us, as I mentioned, that's going to be a 2-mile bike test on an assault bike. And it doesn't have to be an assault bike. All it has to do is be some sort of test running or biking that lasts about 5 to 6 minutes, because it needs to be long enough so that you know that they are producing energy primarily aerobically. So it can't be a 10-second sprint. You're not going to get information on that. For us, in our situation with our logistics, assault bike works best. So we will test an athlete. We'll have them ride a 2-mile time. And what we'll take is we'll take the average RPM, or the average speed, over that 2-mile time. And then we know that that is going to be 100% of their maximum aerobic speed. So when we program different intervals, as you'll see in phase 2, we want to make sure we're programming at 120% of that maximum aerobic speed. So if I do a 2-mile bike test and it takes me 5 minutes, that'd be really fast. But if it takes me 5 minutes and my RPM is 70, okay, I know that when I want to do my interval training and I want to work at 120% of that speed, I want my RPM to be at 84 when I'm doing my intervals, because 84 RPMs is 120% of 70 RPMs, okay? Going into phase 2. So now that we've gone through kind of our preparation 3 weeks phase, now we're going to start to introduce shuttle running and some more change of direction work. Okay, so we're increasing the intensity of the running, both metabolically and muscularly. Metabolically with longer running or higher intensity running, and muscularly with adding some change of direction into the shuttles. Now, we like shuttle runs because athletes are going to change directions in their sport. If you only have them run intervals on a track and they're a soccer player or a hockey player or a basketball player, they're not getting any change of direction work, and they're not preparing for that stimulus in their sport. A lot of times when athletes return to preseason, you'll see injuries ramp up because they haven't done any significant change of direction work in their training, in their off-season training. So we want to make sure we're preparing for that stimulus. And as I mentioned before, all of our intervals, our bike intervals, are going to be training at 120% of maximum aerobic speed. So the research shows, which is pretty interesting, is it doesn't really matter how long the intervals are, whether it was 15 on, 15 off, or 20 on, 10 off, or 30 on, 15 off. The key parameter for increasing aerobic power, which pretty much you can think of, aerobic power allows you to perform more bouts of higher intensity work for longer, okay? So if you think about, I'm playing soccer and I have to sprint to get this ball, that's really anaerobic in nature because I'm going full speed to sprint to this 50-50 ball. Well, in order to be able to do that more and for longer, I need to increase my aerobic power. Okay, so this is what training at 120% of MAS does. But regardless of the work rest intervals you set, the key parameter for increasing aerobic power was just that you are training at 120% of MAS. So whether that is, like I said, 10 seconds on, 20 off, or 20 on, 10 off, or 15 on, 15 off, which is the 3 we choose to use because they work nice with the assault bike. As long as we're at that 120% MAS RPM, that is what matters. And then we're going to be dealing in heart rate-based recoveries. So we want to make sure that we are always recovering down to somewhere in the 60% of your maximum heart rate range for an interval, because that will show that we are ready to recover, the athlete is ready to recover, and put the same amount of intensity into the next interval. Also, we are earlier in the off season that we can do heart rate-based recovery. Moving into phase 3 and 4, as you'll see, we need to start to think about specific work-rest ratios. So this is where your sports analysis comes in. We're still going to do intervals, but we're going to start to move away from a heart rate-based recovery, and we're going to start to move towards intervals that more closely align with the work-rest ratios in the sport that athlete plays. So American football and soccer and hockey are all going to have different work-rest ratios for how the athletes play that sport. So as you get later in the offseason, you need to start to tailor some of your running workouts to make sure that you're preparing for the specific work-rest ratios that those athletes have in their sport. And then factor in external training as you get into later offseason. So think the last 3-4 weeks of off-season training, a lot of these athletes are going to have started to play their sport a little bit more anyway. So you need to be checking in with them to make sure that they're not doing any more conditioning on top of what you're already doing. And if they are, you need to change your program because of that. So if they have captain's practice, or if they go out and they know that they're going to be doing something and they like to do this because it makes them feel better mentally, you need to add and think about all this stuff when you're programming your conditioning so that you know you're not just overfilling that bucket like we talked about earlier. Cool. That's all I got.
Well done, Steve. So with the MAS stuff, I know personally myself, when I first heard max aerobic speed and how to test for that, I was very confused. Kevin, are you okay with us sharing? I have your video up of how to.
I'm actually typing an answer for somebody in the Q&A right now as we go through this.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play your movement video on how to score a max aerobic speed test on a bike.
Okay, cool.
I tried to explain it as simply as possible, but some things are.
It is not easily explained, Biggs. But
you can actually watch me do a Cooper.
You can actually watch Kevin.
Oh, nice! I get a view out of this too.
That's true. You get one view from me, and maybe other people will watch it too, but probably not.
2,500 views. Yikes!
Yeah.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? It's Kevin Carr. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Movement. And in today's episode, we're going to talk a little bit about conditioning. In a recent post, I said the one thing I want to see in the fitness world in 2018 is more intelligent heart rate-based conditioning programs. In a response to that, I had a whole bunch of people reach out to me asking, what assessment do I use to try to determine the appropriate intensity and the appropriate recovery for my clients? So in this episode, I'm going to cover the modified Cooper's test. The modified Cooper's test is a 7-minute time trial that can be done running or cycling. The client should be instructed to complete the test as fast as possible, but at a steady intensity, meaning we don't want them to come really hard out the gate and then crash down and be exhausted. If anything, we want them to build up slowly to a high intensity and maintain that intensity through the completion of the time trial. The Cooper's test will help us determine the client's maximum aerobic intensity. We'll measure this using their average heart rate, which will roughly equate to their anaerobic threshold, as well as their average speed, which will be measured in either miles per hour, meters per second, or RPMs. Both of these measures will help us determine appropriate intensities for interval-based conditioning. In this assessment, we're also going to measure 1-minute heart rate recovery following the test, which is a great measure of aerobic fitness. So here you can see me riding the bike, and you can see my heart rate reflected on the monitor up on the screen.
Nice screen.
Notice how it steadily rises and then maintains relatively stable once it reaches a peak heart rate. During this test, the coach should be recording the heart rate data at the top of every minute, so later on you can calculate the anaerobic threshold. Or if your monitoring system provides you a summary afterward, you could just use that. We'll just speed up my test here so you don't have to watch me suffer for all 7 minutes. At the end of the test, there are a few more pieces of info we'll want to gather. You can calculate the max aerobic speed by dividing the distance covered by the time elapsed on the test. This bike conveniently provides an average RPM readout, so if you have an Airdyne or Assault bike, you could just use that. After the completion of the test, you'll want to see how quickly the athlete recovers in the 1 minute following. 1 minute heart rate recovery is a good indicator of aerobic fitness. I would like to see my athletes be able to drop by over 35 beats in the minute following this test. So, quick summary of my data here. I covered a distance of 3 miles in 6 minutes and 57 seconds. My max aerobic speed, which was my average speed over the course of the test, measured in RPMs, was 67 RPMs. My estimated threshold heart rate, based on my average heart rate over the course of the test, was 163 beats per minute. And my 1 minute recovery was 60 beats, which had me recovering from 174 beats per minute down to 114 beats per minute in 60 seconds. So that was the modified Cooper's test completed on the Assault bike. Like I said, you can use the same protocol for running. You just might have to do a little bit more math afterwards. Stay tuned for the next episode because I'm going to show you how we can take this data to apply the appropriate intensities and rest periods for our conditioning interval.
Did you ever finish that next episode?
I didn't make a YouTube. I just made like an Instagram post.
Oh, okay. We'll share that with everybody.
Yeah.
But really, I wanted to show that because I think I encourage everyone to find their own max aerobic speed and then to do their own numbers and do their own calculations, because there's no other way to really understand how it works until you do it yourself.
And I think it's as simple as like, even it doesn't even have to be as complicated as the video. Like when we do it with the groups, like we don't need to record their heart rate. Like if you really want to, like with the personal training clients, I'll track their heart rate over the course of it. But with groups of kids, it's just logistically, like Steve said, logistics are going to be what make the decisions for you. You don't have to record their heart rate. Like we just make sure we have their average speed, and then we use that average speed over the course of the test to be able to predict their intensity levels for their intervals. And then we also have their time for that time trial so we can retest them at the end. And that's really what the important part is. And that just gives you a measure to measure progress and to make sure their intensities on their intervals are appropriate for them. Because often you throw the kids on the bike and they do 2 really hard ones and then they empty their gas tank because we didn't give them a number to try to sprint at, which is really why we do this.
Right. And that's the most important part, is that the reason why we did it was because we used to tell people to just get on the bike and ride as hard as they could for 20 seconds, 8 times. And there was no rhyme or reason or how fast or how hard. It was just, hey, get on the bike and go for 20 seconds and then rest for 40 seconds. And we realized that we weren't getting everything we could out of our conditioning, because human nature is to do really 2 hard ones and then the other 6 just pack it in, because those 2 were hard. So giving people that 120% of their max aerobic speed is really helpful for being more specific, right? We're really specific with our percentages and how many reps and sets and warm-up numbers and 90% of my max, but we weren't doing that with conditioning. Anything to add, Biggs?
Yeah, and I think like one thing that, just to add on what you said, Brendan, remember, if you are just having the athletes go at 100% for their intervals, it's not that it's not going to help them per se, but you have to remember that what is the cost of your training? So anything anaerobically, any production of energy anaerobically comes at a greater cost physiologically to the system. And anything aerobically comes at a less cost to the system. That's why you can produce aerobic energy over longer periods of time. So with this maximum aerobic speed number, yes, you are working anaerobically, 100%. But you're doing it at an intelligent level that you can do it for a little bit longer. You're not just gassing yourself out and providing too much physiological cost to the system to the point where you might overflow the recovery bucket or the non-recovery bucket, whatever you want to call it. You have an empty recovery bucket. You're doing it at a speed that allows you to perform quality work, and we know that quality is greater than quantity, a speed that allows you to perform quality work, which then in turn allows you, as I mentioned before, to produce those maximum bouts of anaerobic energy longer and more frequently, which is what you want to happen for team sport, because we know that the anaerobic bouts of exercise or of energy is what's going to be your winning game situations in sport. If we can do those more often and for longer, you're going to have an athlete that's more prepared.
And to your point, that's why we don't do conditioning first. Because if we did conditioning at the beginning of the workout, then all of our power and strength stuff would suffer. So I love to use the example of box jumps or vertical or just vertical jumps. We do vertical jumps after we've done a proper warm-up or a dynamic warm-up, and then we jump because we are most neurologically ready, but we are not neurologically fatigued yet. And when we program jumps, it's not that you're doing 5 jumps or 10 jumps. You're doing one jump 5 times because it's about power. And if it's about power and you want to get more powerful, then you need to be 100% max effort for your jump and plyometric drills. Then conditioning comes at the end because now it doesn't require as much of the nervous system. And now we're going to use that conditioning to try to increase our fitness so that we can jump more times in a row. The problem is now people, because jumping is difficult and it's a lot on the nervous system, people use jumping as conditioning. And jumping is the worst way to do conditioning, because if you've ever watched anybody do multiple box jumps in a row for conditioning, it isn't pretty. And it's no longer powerful, it's just them suffering to survive. So you'll notice that most of our conditioning is done either running with tempo runs or shuttles, so form running or turns, and then on the bike. We don't do a lot of this like crazy conditioning stuff where we're trying to crush you. If we're trying to crush you, we're doing it on a safe item like a bike, right? The only way to get hurt on a bike is if something falls on top of you while you're riding the bike, or the bike comes apart and you fall off of it. Running, there's more ways to get injured running for sure, but because we're not running, we're running at a tempo that's form running. And like Steve said, it's all graded. We never start out with, you're going to run 9 300-yard shuttles today. It's your first day in the gym. You don't run shuttles until you're already 9 to 10 weeks into training. And I'm actually going to show my screen here just so people can see this conceptually. So this is, everyone knows how I love regressions and progressions and checklists. Running progression. So you can see here on the right-hand side, week 1 is 8 total tempo runs at 70% of your max for 60 yards. It's 480 total yards. Then the next week we go to 10, which is 600 total yards. Then 12, 720, 14 for 840 total yards. Now we maintain our tempo runs for weeks 5 through 12 just for form running, but then we move to shuttle runs. So shuttle runs, you're going harder, faster, and now you're adding turns. So every time you add a turn, you increase the difficulty. Turns are also a lot on the lower limbs. So we have week 5, we're going to do 6 75-yard shuttles, which would be 450 total yards. Next week, we go to 8, then 10, then 12. So you can see the increase in intensity, but also the increase in yardage. But we didn't go from 840 to 900. We went back down because we increased the intensity by going to shuttles. Then we go to 300-yard shuttles with 150-yard shuttles, and you can see 9, 10, 11, 12. We're increasing the total yards, and we do that over a 12-week time period. And if you look at the rest of the sheet, everything is progressed over time. We start with cardiac output and tempo work, and then we work to aerobic power, alactic. But like Steve said, don't get so worried about what the names are of the things. Be worried about how you're progressing people from the beginning to the end. And that's what's most important. So I just wanted people to see that, what it would look like over a 12-week period, which you could do the same thing with the bike. If you use the rower, you could use that with a rower. You could use the ropes. There's all sorts of different conditioning modalities that fit in here. You just need to tell me where you're going to begin and then where you're going to progress to over an 8, 10, 12-week, 16-week time period. All right, do we want to answer some questions here?
Let's do it.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen again, get rid of this. then no more YouTube. All right, so Mike asked adaptations for individuals who can't have high impact. So we're probably thinking leg injury or back pain. Either of you want to take that one?
I would say that, kind of as mentioned, most of our conditioning as you get to whether that's an older adult or an athlete that has been in their sport for a while, a lot of conditioning turns to bike riding because it is lower impact. Now, is being in a seated position with shortened hip flexors necessarily the best action? No, but it might be the least worst option for an individual like this. So with the bike, you have practically zero impact, provided it doesn't bother knees, and maybe flexion-based back pain isn't too much. But for most people, I would say 99% of the time, people can tolerate the bike. So that's what we generally do. And that's what we do for everyone. So even if they are healthy, so it doesn't really matter if they have something or they can't do impact, because they're going to be doing the same thing that most of the other athletes are doing anyway. So it's not like we're having this person, because you have to also think from a mental side of training. You don't want this one person on the team to be doing something completely different than what the rest of the team's doing. You want to keep somewhat of a level of camaraderie, of teamwork. So it ends up working out fine. And the bike is honestly, it's the, like we said, it's the least worst conditioning tool you can do. And you can very easily track it, especially if you have an assault or an airdyne bike.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about, like, what are we substituting, right? Like, so from a training goal standpoint or a mode of exercise standpoint, like if I'm thinking about a general population client, it's a lot easier to find an adaptation or something to change for someone who can't have high impact, right? They could do bike, they could do ropes, they could do slide board, they could just do circuits in the weight room, right? Whereas with an athlete, we have to be much more specific to their mode and much less likely to choose, circuits or choose ropes or things like that, where, like Steve said, the bike is a very easy option for most of our athletes. So where with adult clients, we might get a little bit more creative with what we use for quote unquote conditioning or energy system development.
Susan asked, would you program conditioning for power athletes after they lift? I already addressed that we always put conditioning at the end, because we do not want our power and strength training to suffer because you're so tired from the conditioning part. What are your favorite conditioning assessments? Do we have anything else other than really the MAS max aerobic speed test on the bike that we use?
No, I would say no, but I can answer this question in the sense that, so that's a good question, because one thing we didn't mention is testing. Well, one, besides the MAS test, we tend to not do any testing because a lot of the athletes we train are not fit for a specialized test, especially in running. So that's why we start with this lower volume, lower intensity, and we build up to the point, and you are monitoring them throughout the phases, keeping track of their times, making sure they're not getting worse. So it's almost like every day is a test in its own right. But one thing we will do is, if we have college athletes or athletes coming from professional sports, you are doing your athlete a disservice if you are not asking them what they are being tested in at school, or when they go back to school, when they go back to training camp. And even if that test doesn't philosophically align with what you want to do in your training, you still have to do it, because you need to prepare your athlete. So an example is this: we had a hockey girl, college hockey player at our gym, whose conditioning test was 8 300s with a minute rest in between each 300s, 300-yard shuttles at 25 yards. So that's just crazy. Like that's really hard. Like you're not even running close to full speed at that point. But we need to make sure that we're training her for that, because regardless of if we like that test or not, she's going to have to do it. And if she doesn't prepare for that, she's going to fail that test. So I would say our favorite conditioning assessments are just making sure that you are being smart with your coaching and asking your athletes what they have to do when they return to training. And if you are someone who's in charge of creating tests, we tend to still stick with kind of the 300-yard shuttle. We'll look at 2 300-yard shuttles with, generally we're going to go at like a 1 to 2 work rest. So if it takes 60 seconds to run, we're going to rest for 120 seconds or 2 minutes, because it gives you a good idea of how someone can work or work rate at a higher intensity over a longer period of time. So now we're getting into what we talked about, lactic capacity. You're working at 60 seconds of work. But other than that, I would say we don't have any favorite tests, if you will. As we said before, testing it's kind of flirting the line with are you overcomplicating training?
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to keep it simple,
as
always.
So to that point, Steve, I said earlier that everything's conditioning. Everything is also like programming and following your program and writing down what each athlete is doing each week and using your progressions and regressions. That's testing every single workout, like you said. So you're testing every single day, essentially, that they're there. Do either of you have any experience with the yo-yo test? I don't have a lot. We got a lot of yo-yo test questions, if we use it or not. I'm familiar with it and I know how it works, but I don't know
I did it I had to do it in college. I mean, I think it works. I mean, it's not like bad. Like nothing is bad. There's just different philosophies behind things.
Yeah.
If you are a strength conditioning coach for a soccer team or a rugby team or one of these real intermittent, high intensity bouts of exercise with shorter recoveries, then I think it can do the job fine. You just need to make sure you are layering your training to build up to that test. You can't have your team do a yo-yo test at the end of your training cycle, but only have done 150-yard shuttles or something that we might be doing when we're building up to 300-yard shuttles. You just need to make sure, as I said in that slide, that the testing contorts to the training.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add, Kev?
No.
So Anna asked, what strategies do you use to make conditioning fun or interesting with athletes while still ensuring a quality workout?
I'll answer this one.
I'll start by just saying, remember, nobody conditions alone. So when you do it together, that makes all the difference in the world. Maybe it's not more fun, but it's at least more sufferable.
Yeah, and
Steve, continue.
This might make me sound like the hard-o strength coach, but Brendan just said sufferable. So one thing, now you said, Anna, you said athletes, so that's what I'm going on here. We're going on talking about athletes. Adults is a different story, but strategies used to make conditioning fun for athletes, quite frankly, conditioning isn't fun. And it shouldn't be fun because you're preparing for high-intensity stimulus in sporting events. So I think it's the job of the coach to teach the athletes that, hey, this is the portion of the workout that everyone hates for a reason. But this is also a very big portion of what's going to make you better at your sport. I think it's your job as a coach to make the entire training process fun, not just individual specific types of the training fun. Conditioning, I'm running a 300-yard shuttle. At no point is that going to be fun. If I'm doing 2 rounds of 2010s for 10 minutes, that's on the assault bike, that's never going to be fun. But if you create a fun training environment and a friendly training environment, a friendly competitive training environment, then overall the athlete's not going to worry about this being particularly hard, because that's just something you have to accept about sports and training for sports.
Yeah, going off what Steve said, I think your relationship and how you make the entire training experience enjoyable for that athlete earns you goodwill to essentially put them through conditioning. Like if the athlete doesn't really like you or doesn't like training with you, they're definitely not going to like doing the shitty part of the workout where they have to run shuttles or do intervals. But if generally they like you, like I know Steve's athletes really like spending time with Steve. And then when he says, hey, it's time to get to work and do, 150s or go do intervals on the bike, then they're probably much more likely to want to go do that. So like he said, you can't make shuttles fun. But I think if you develop a really good relationship with the athletes, they're going to be more likely to go into that with a little bit more vigor and more of a smile on their face. So.
Yeah, and they'll feed off your energy. So if you're sitting down with a stopwatch saying, go, 60 seconds, go, like you should be up, you should be clapping, you should be moving up and down. Like whatever your energy is the energy you're going to get out of them. The one thing you can do is it's kind of a little bit of bribery, but hey, if you guys do this conditioning stuff, we'll play spike ball after. If you do this conditioning stuff, we'll go play basketball outside. We'll go throw the football. We'll go, because they love that stuff. So if you do this now for me, we'll get to do this later. It works well for my daughter sometimes, but not all the time, just
It
occasionally.
works well for me too. Rain's
Works well
5
for
and I'm
Steve, right?
27. If you tell me we can play spike ball after, I'll do whatever you want me to.
See? So yeah, that can work too. So, but yeah, nothing about conditioning is fun. It's true conditioning. How do you discuss conditioning with people who only want to run or people who don't want to do conditioning, or how do you maybe sprinkle it in without them knowing? Kev, you get this all the time at Movement is Medicine with injuries, right? So somebody who's injured from running, but they still want to run.
Yeah, I think you have to be able to meet them where they are. Like, again, like usually when you're talking to someone who is like a runner or just like anybody who has a sport, like that's going to be their number one focus. Like they're coming to me at Movement is Medicine for rehab because they want to go back to running. They're not coming to me solely because their knee hurts. It's like because they miss their addiction that they have, right? So I think you have to bargain with these people. And maybe if it says like from an injury standpoint, if I say, hey, how about we work on riding the bike for the next like few weeks while we work on getting the knee better, and you go and you walk consistently, like so you get your fix, and then we start to kind of build that volume back up. Like Steve said, that upside down pyramid. Usually the volume is what got them in the trouble in the first place. So I'll say, hey, why don't we just start with some shorter run walk? Like we do a lot of stuff with our adults actually at MBSC where they'll run, jog, walk. Like once you start with something like that or tempo runs, and then you can start to build up your volume from there. And then when you're dealing with people who are runners and they don't understand why you might want them to push a sled or do a bike sprint or even do a slide board, I think having a discussion with them about how these other things might actually help them with what they do. Like, hey, you really like running and building a little bit of running volume every week. Maybe let me tell you why pushing the sled 1 or 2 days a week in addition, instead of running right after your lift all the time, is going to be better for you because you can improve your running economy and produce powerful hip extension that's going to help you run more efficiently. Or maybe doing some high intensity bike sprints, one will take away all the impact that you're getting. It'll give you more impact to go use on the road when you go, but also can train that top end of your anaerobic power that's going to actually help you when you're working up that hill when you're out running on your own. So like starting to talk to them about goals and how variable conditioning options will impact what they really care about, if that's running or something else, I think is important because usually they just don't know what they don't know.
Education is what it comes down to. And Steve, anything to add?
Nope, that's
Okay.
good.
So Pat asked, how much tech do you guys rely on for health and wellness, athletic performance? It depends, right? Steve asked, how do you use heart rate monitoring during team conditioning, or do you at all?
As far as
I'm not a big fan of tech, but
I would say the only tech now, keep in mind, this is being at a private strength and conditioning facility. We're not a professional sports team, but we rely on pretty much 3 things, you could say. We use timers to time sprints. We use a just jump mat to monitor vertical jumps and 4 jump tests. And then we use heart rate monitors to monitor heart rate. And then I'll let Kevin expand on heart rate monitors because he's good at that. But even like heart rate monitor during team conditioning, the chances that we get an entire group of 15 high school athletes or even college athletes to buy a heart rate monitor is still low. Generally, the only group that is having everyone has a heart rate monitor is going to be the pro athletes. So it just comes down, like we said earlier, the logistical considerations aspect of it. If you are trying to get a high school soccer team to buy heart rate monitors, just know that they might not buy them. But as it said remember the role of the strength conditioning coach, we're going to be focused much more on kind of the anaerobic power aspects of training anyway. So we do heavily rely on sprint timers and just jump mats because running 10-yard sprints and measuring vertical jump are just good monitoring tools for one, if people are increasing from a sprint speed and power aspect, but they're also the best things we can do to make sure that we are accurately measuring those.
Yeah, like when Steve said about, technology, it comes down to a few things. It's logistics, it costs, and then what do you really care about, right? So logistically, like, you know, for us to have to manage a bunch of different data inputs when you have, like, on a summer day, you know, God willing, when COVID ends, we have like 400 people come through there in a day, right? So, you know, we want to make data collection easy. If you're going to run a program with a lot of athletes, when we're doing sprint times, it's very efficient. I read off a time, they remember their time, we record their time. With vertical jump, we read off their time, we record their best jump. It's very simple. And with the heart rate monitoring, we have the 3-4 big screens in the gym that we can monitor, like, hey, you're running tempos. Why don't you let your heart rate get back down to the blue before you go again, right? Like, real simple conversations like that. And like Steve said, with high school kids, like, we, in a private sector, we can't mandate that they purchase these heart rate monitors, right? Because, you know, even though training is a luxury, you know, what people are willing to invest economically into heart rate monitors varies. And even if they did all buy them, you know, what you realize when you work with people is sometimes the battle is getting them to remember to use them or remember to charge them. I have one adult client who Brendan used to train who has a heart rate monitor, and he only brings it about 1 every 10 sessions. Like, oh, I forgot it again, right? And so, like, half the battle for me, I'm like, hey, bring your heart monitor. Oh, I forgot to charge it, right? So, you know, you do the best you can with what you have, but you're dealing with human nature. But if we can use it as a guide to give them recovery and say, like, hey, get back down under 70%, or, you know, get into the green or the blue, it is a really good tool to have. But sometimes we have to go by time to work rest ratios. But the one thing we're most consistent with, like Steve said, is vertical jump measuring and sprint testing.
As a little disclaimer, in the context of who we see is your average person and your average athlete working in a facility that you can have up to 400 people, 500 workouts a day. We are not if we had access to what a professional soccer team had access to, or a professional baseball, or one of the 4 major sports have access to, GPS, like, GPS is amazing. But most of the people who are trainers who are making money training do not have access to those things. So therefore, we don't really use them that much. So tech is a wonderful thing, but it can be paralysis by analysis. Like, you have almost too much stuff. Like, sports teams now have people who legit just only crunch data. They get paid $100,000 a year to just take the data and do something with it. And we're all trainers trying to train 6 to 7, 8 people a day, and just make everybody feel better and more healthy. So think of that when we're talking about these things. Is yes, there are much more elaborate conditioning tests, conditioning tools, conditioning tech, but most people don't need that. Next slide. Andy asked, what's the minimal effective dose for conditioning someone in a Gen Pop versus a high school collegiate athlete with a busy schedule and time constraints? I guess this is a tough one, because if you're trying to save time, you need to do the work. You need to train 3 to 4 days a week, or you're just not going to get in good shape. So, I mean, for us, it's a minimum of 3 to 4 days a week for an hour, I would say. Not conditioning only, but training in general, which means it's going to be about 30 to 45 minutes of strength training, or what we would call functional training, with probably 10 to 40 minutes total of true conditioning or anaerobic or interval work over a week's time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the positive also, if you think, like, if you're going to do high intensity interval type work for the majority of conditioning, you are getting minimum effective dose, right? Because you're not doing those long, slow distance. So that is, I mean, also, like we said about logistics determining our conditioning, like Steve said, you look in some of these old programming and like conditioning type books, and it's like, all right, they'll have prescriptions that say, like, you know, do a 10-second sprint and rest 5 minutes and do 20 sets. And I'm like, all right, I can't, we have these kids that are coming for like 90 minutes. Like, you have to realize, like, people have schedules outside, right? So it's a good question by Andy. And so for us, like, going back to what Brendan said, if they're warming up and they're doing med ball and then they're doing lifting and they've played a sport recently, most of our athletes have their aerobic window checked, right? So then their minimum effective dose, like Steve said, is probably 12 minutes of conditioning work, whether that's tempos, like 10 tempo runs, or whether that's, some intervals on the bike. You can get a lot done in 60 to 90 minutes. So I would say 60 to 90 minutes is minimum effective dose. I think we do that pretty well.
Yeah. Biggs, anything?
No, that was perfect.
Yeah. So, well, if you give yourself, think of it as this: if you're going to go home and program for somebody, how much can you get done in 12 minutes of conditioning? Maybe that's like a little challenge you can make for yourself. Like, okay, instead of me thinking I have 2 hours to train this person, what if I only had 12 minutes to train this person? What bucket would I spend most of my time filling? So decrease your parameters, which will really force you to get creative and think. Julia asked.
Real quick before you go into Julia, I have one thing that just kind of popped into my head too. Like, I think, we always think about conditioning as, again, making people tired, but like Steve talked about, we're very consistent with sprint training. Like at every time these kids come in, they're at least doing 2 100% max effort sprints, right? And we talk about minimum effective dose, but I think often people hear like 2 sprints and think it's like that can't be effective. But I think we underestimate, what type of central nervous system training effect that is. That is still conditioning, right? We talk about the best athletes in each sport being the ones who can jump the highest, run the fastest, most explosive, right? You don't watch highlights on SportsCenter of the marathon. You watch highlights of LeBron dunking. There's a reason everyone's watching like the Jordan documentary right now, right? So it's because those people are explosive, and those are the people that break games open. So consistently, like having people do max effort jumps and max effort sprints that only might be 2 to 5 reps, that doesn't take a lot, right? So, I mean, I think people say like, what are you doing in quarantine for minimum effective dose to keep our athletes fit? And it's like, go out and run some hard sprints and go out, do some jumping and some throwing. And I think that is probably minimum effective dose for the athlete specifically.
I'll tell a quick story. When I was, I think, 22 years old, we were all working for Mike that day, and Mike had 150 soccer coaches come in to the gym for Mike to just talk about training soccer players. And if Mike's just trained like selective amounts of soccer players, Mike is not a soccer guy or anything. And I'll never forget that Mike said his first line was, who do you want to get, or what do you want? The athlete who can get to the ball first, or the athlete that can last the whole game? And you just saw like 150 light bulbs go off, because of course you want the athlete who can get to the ball first, because if you can't get to the ball and get the ball, it doesn't matter. And so like Mike went on this whole tirade about how soccer players shouldn't be running for long distances. They shouldn't be running miles, timed miles. They should be doing strength and power work, and then do conditioning that is all interval based, right? Because the best soccer players in the world are the most efficient. They run really fast and get the ball, and then they are really efficient in between not having the ball. And then they go and get the ball, and then they beat everybody and they score the goal, and then they rest in between. So I'll never forget Mike saying that you want the athlete that can get to the ball first, and then the athlete that can do it for the entire game. But the athlete that can do it for the entire game doesn't matter if they can't get to the ball first.
And just one quick thing. Now, this is not obviously required, but Mike's conditioning product, is very good. He has a complete conditioning DVD series that's very, very good, and it explains pretty much everything we're talking about. But it's like 8 hours or 6 hours of DVD content, all on conditioning, that you can kind of get the feel for.
Yeah, I'll put that in the resources as well, with all the books that we've talked about. So Julia asked, she wanted to know about conditioning for extreme sports, and hers was wakeboarding. So I added this question because we had question. I saw dance, I saw cheer, I saw what were a few of the other sports? Golf conditioning, baseball pitching, like pitcher conditioning. And for me, I think it's that most of these sports, these individual sports, are way more anaerobic. Like pitching a baseball and swinging a golf club is the most anaerobic thing you can do, because it takes less than 5 seconds to complete the swing or the throw. So do you need to be able to run a mile? I don't know. Like, you need to be able to pitch 6 to 7 innings maybe. So maybe you need a little bit of aerobic base, but you don't need to have a 6 or 5 minute mile time. So to wakeboard, do you need to have a 5 minute mile to wakeboard? Like, I would guess no. Like, I think, Steve, you talked about this, and it's all context dependent. So you have to go watch the sport, or you have to participate in the sport in order to have an idea of what kind of conditioning that they need. So in the beginning, everybody gets lumped into the same conditioning, right? Which we would call general physical preparedness, which is just your average baseline fundamental conditioning that everybody needs, which I would say is the first 8 weeks of everyone's program. So the first 8 weeks for everybody is the same. We all have the same cardiovascular system, nervous system, movement patterns, lymphatic system, all of those things. But at week 8 or week 12 or whatever it is, you then become more specific, which you were saying, Steve, you then go watch the sport.
And you have to remember that, as I also said before, especially with these kind of I don't want to say traditional, that's not the right word, but your non kind of strength, speed, power sports, not that pitching and golf isn't speed, power, but don't forget that playing the sport also builds capacity. So, for example, you said wakeboarding. If you are wakeboarding, and most places that you can wakeboard properly are going to be warmer weather climates. So you're going to have the ability to wakeboard more than just 3 months a year, like you might in a sports season in the Northeast, for example, is basketball season for a high school kid. So my guess is that you're not taking a significant time period away from wakeboarding, like a 6 to 9 month period where you are being detrained in that sport. And if you think golfers, if I'm in Florida and I'm a golfer, you better believe that I'm going to be playing golf year round. So I'm going to have the capacity to do my sport regardless of what I do in the gym, because you're not just going to suddenly get more tired. So you have to also think for dancing or cheerleading. If I'm dancing and cheering, I'm going to have the capacity to do that. So we need to look at the buckets that are less full and work from there. So if I'm a dancer or cheerleader, probably a pretty good chance that my mobility bucket is overflowing times 1,000, and my strength bucket and my stability bucket is pretty low. So I might want to work on that to prevent injury and learn how to control these incredible ranges of motion that I can achieve with my joints. So always remember that playing the sport also builds capacity in playing the sport, especially in sports that aren't necessarily going to be bringing you to maximum heart rates with very intermittent recoveries, and you need to then get to that heart rate at a very high stimulus again.
And I would argue too, Steve, like you're saying, if somebody has a ton of mobility and they have decent conditioning, but their power and strength buckets are empty, I would say if you didn't do any conditioning at all and you only worked on those power and strength buckets, I could almost guarantee their conditioning bucket would improve because they have more power and more strength now. Same thing with mobility. If you lack mobility and you give somebody mobility back and they can get into a better position, that means they're more efficient. That means they use less energy. That means they got into better shape without doing any conditioning at all. So this is where the bucket idea comes into play, is like it's so important to work on the correct bucket, and that each bucket, the hierarchy, right? So working on each bucket will help the others as well. We had a question about in the Q&A, do either of you use resting heart rate, or what are our
just answering that?
Yeah, to kind of discuss with somebody what might be overtraining or what might be just them not
not always over. I mean, it can be a good way if you start to see a rise in heart rate. The big thing with any of this data is you have to track it consistently, right? Because you can get aberrations where someone wakes up with a high heart rate because they're stressed or they didn't sleep well that day. or maybe they just drank too much coffee or something. So you do have to track consistently. I think the time that we would track it is like, I look at resting heart rate consistently with Gen Pop clients more than anything. The people who might be really deconditioned, really out of shape, people who have real health concerns, I will say, hey, record your heart rate every day for me. So that way we can graph it and look, so we can see, hey, you consistently waking up at like 72 or 76 beats per minute. That's too high. With most of the athletes, almost all of their resting heart rates, like if I were to look at those guys in the pro group, they're all in the 40s, like when they wake up in the morning. And we can kind of start to tell pretty quickly when we think about overtraining with them, just based on when we start to get to phase 3 and phase 4, when those work periods are getting longer for them. That tends to be when we have to cut back maybe things in the weight room, or from there. And Steve can weigh in on that. But with the athletes, we're not looking at resting nearly as much as maybe I would be with a deconditioned adult client.
Kevin, you know that the Patrick Ward seminar that you did a long time ago?
Mm-hmm.
And he had a whole thing about how asking these 5 questions was just as good as testing somebody's heart rate or heart rate variability. If you ask these 5 questions, do you remember what the 5 questions were, or what a few?
Yeah, so this is an interesting study. You can find it. They looked at like subjective questionnaire versus like a bunch of other internal markers for readiness. And they found subjective questionnaires, when done consistently, were just as consistent. So like actually were more consistent than any of these other markers. So they were, it was graded 1 to 5 for each of these. And I think sometimes they would have like a coordinated smiley face that went with each number, from like kind of sad and tired to like really happy. And so like, how sore are you today? What was the quality of your sleep last night? How much energy do you have? How excited are you to train? And I think it was like, I can't remember what the 5th one was, but I actually have it somewhere. I can dig for it. And it was, if you consistently ask those, because we did that one summer where we actually like handed those things out. It was a pain in the ass. I had those pieces of paper everywhere. And track those numbers. You can you'll find when there's one that's way off the chart and you're like, okay, why do you feel that way? But then also usually it's that athlete that walks in with a scowl on their face, they look tired. So I think, again, it goes back to relationships. I feel like it's so repetitive that we say that, but I think Steve or Brendan could tell you, if they've had an athlete come in one day, if you would give them a questionnaire that day, there would have been a lot of 1s and 2s, but you could also probably look at them and say, it doesn't look like they're doing too great today.
Yeah. If you have somebody for long enough, you get to know them pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, that's why, like, those, I remember Linda was going to make the t-shirt for me that said, hey, how you feeling? Because like literally you ask the same question to the person when they come in every time. And then like when you become real sensitive to their response, their demeanor, and what they look like, and how they respond to that, if you ask the same question enough.
And more of a nuanced addition to that statement, with athletes in particular, another thing to think about, now we're talking gray areas, which always get gray, but in off-season training, provided that athlete is only doing your off-season training and is not, like I said, has buckets overflowing everywhere else, part of off-season training is adapting to increased workloads. So there are going to be days where your athletes are tired, and those questionnaire scores or those facial expressions and their eyes are going to be drooping and they're going to look tired. But remember that is part of training. And now we're not advocating that you do things dangerously and you keep increasing volume or intensity, but remember that part of training is to adapt to being tired and increased workload. So that is a normal part of training. If someone comes to training, if you're training 4 days in a row and someone comes and it's been 6 weeks and someone comes in tired, that's pretty normal. They're going to be tired. So just know that as well.
Well, that and it's game day. Do you get to decide if you want to play or not? Like, oh, my HRV and my resting heart rate is a little high today. I think I'm going to take the day off, coach. Right. I got an MMA fight at 5 p.m. today, but my resting heart rate says I shouldn't do it. So I'm just going to bow out. Like, so there's a, like you said, gray area where we are now perpetuating something that might then become a problem, where people are now too afraid of soreness and too afraid of being tired because that is part of the human condition and playing sports is you're not going to feel good every single time you go out there and play. And sometimes your best game and your best workouts are the ones where you came in feeling the worst, like with Michael Jordan flu game. So there's a psychological piece to this as well, where if you start relying too much on data, you can sometimes be led down the wrong road. Mark asks, how would you periodize your conditioning for field-based athletes if you had 8 to 12 weeks, and what is your rationale for that periodization?
Mark the legend, Mark Durkin, the legend. Well, I think we kind of went over it in what I talked about, but I think at the end of the day, kind of what we said, look at the sport first. So you know kind of the work rest intervals that you are aiming to be at by the time an athlete goes back to preseason. Now, weeks 1 to 3, if we're talking 12 weeks, week 1 to 3 of us, regardless of that sport, is always going to be, like we said, tempo. It's not competitive. There's minimal direction change. Remember, we're preparing for higher intensity stimuli that are going to happen over weeks 4 to 12. And once you get out of phase 1 and now we're in weeks 4 to 12, depending on the sport, this periodization is going to look different. The plan is going to look different. As long as you are starting to move in the direction of what you want from a work rest standpoint in that sport. So if I have in week 4 for a football player, American football player, we're probably not going to go to, or say week 4, we do 5, 6, we do 75-yard shuttles for everyone, because it's still in that 10 to 12 second range with a significant recovery where we can use heart rate to get down to 120 before we go. We're working in that higher range so that we're improving our maximum aerobic speed like we talked about, but we're not quite specific enough for the sport, but we're learning how to work hard. You're teaching your athletes that you're going to have to work hard and getting them to intervals. Now we get into phase 3. Well, if I have an American football player, I'm probably going to bring that somewhere down to like a 60-yard shuttle where I incorporate more direction change, but it's going to be shorter than a 75-yard shuttle because their sport, the average play in American football, is 4.8 seconds long. So I don't need them to be running a 150-yard shuttle like I might have for a soccer or a hockey player who I'm building up to be able to work for a higher period of time with a shorter recovery in between bouts. So you need to think about it. Where do I want to be in week 12? And you don't know where you want to be unless you organize and think about what your sport demands.
Kev, you want to say anything? So we've been talking a lot about athletes. Can you just discuss for a second the conditioning kind of mindset for adults, since adults train with us for years at a time, right? They don't have a 12-week competition they're getting ready for. Mm-hmm. What does conditioning look like for maybe, let's say, an adult client who's brand new for the first 12 weeks and then after 12 weeks?
Yep. And so then again, like before we even get into the specifics, going back to like your comment on buckets, right? With the adults, like the number one need with most of them is to fill the movement bucket for most of them. So like, as far as the conditioning out the gate, the intensity is going to be much lower. We're not going to be thinking about like crushing them, even though like when they compare to what is the popular model out there, things like Orange Theory or CrossFit, that's usually what they want. But we're going to try to fill the movement bucket and the strength bucket with them first. So with that in mind, you know, we're going to, they get a real big diet of things like tempo runs, where they're going to be running at a moderate to high intensity, doing, you know, 75% effort down and back. They're pretty much always doing tempo runs throughout all of their phases of training, 1 or 2 days a week, you know, where they're going to be developing their aerobic system, but they get the sensation of sprinting 1 or 2 days a week. Then a lot of them, because of like injury history, you're thinking about our average adult age client is probably 50, right? And so a lot of them have mileage behind them where there's, you know, sporting injuries, back injuries, hip injuries. So they're getting a steady diet of, you know, that max aerobic speed work on the bike, where they're doing, you know, a 10-second sprint followed by a 20-second rest, done at 110% of their max aerobic speed, or 120% of their max aerobic speed. And they're doing that, you know, for 8 repetitions. Then, you know, essentially finding different ways to deliver those things to them. We're not going to be doing a lot of like high intensity circuits where they have short rests. We're not going to be doing a lot of, burpee. We're not going to do any burpees. We're not going to do a lot of ropes. It's not logistically easy for us. We're not going to do a lot of slide boards. Again, not logistically easy for us. Doing different versions of tempo runs, doing different versions of bike sprints is pretty much what we're consistently doing with our adults.
We got a question about competitively athletic over the age of 50. I mean, I still lump them in the bucket of you're over the age of 50. There is this like weekend warrior type person who might do a little more athletic type stuff than the average general population client. But even then, we're still looking at risk versus reward. And is the risk of putting that, like, say you're 60 years old and I'm running 10-yard sprints with that person, is the risk of doing that worth the reward of getting injured? Probably not. But there is this, I would say that it's a small subset of people though, who I put in this weekend warrior, competitive athlete over the age of 35 bucket. Whereas 95% of our people are either just athletes or just general population clients who want help. I don't know if any.
Yeah, I was to say, like, we don't have that many adults who really want to put the gas pedal down because they like are training for something specifically. There's a lot of people who run recreationally or play tennis, or maybe play a little bit of men's league basketball or something, but not like people who are really competitive. Like I have one guy, Matt, who is competitive and extremely athletic for his age, but even him, like I have to finely tune what I prescribe to him because he's one of these the plight of the fast twitch athlete type guys. And as you get older, that becomes even truer because it's easier for them to break down. So for those who don't understand, Mike has this article called the plight of the fast twitch athlete. Usually these guys who are really explosive throughout their entire career also are more likely to suffer things like soft tissue injuries, right? Because they're able to produce so much power that usually they're the ones that suffer strains and things of that nature. And so lots of times you see these, weekend warrior types, and as they get older, they're more and more likely to be suffering those things. So even with a guy like Matt, who I think is probably the best weekend warrior we have, he's still really only doing tempo runs in addition to like his competitive cycling work and the weightlifting he's doing with us. But the conditioning doesn't change that much. And we don't really have anybody at the gym who I would think I look at them, in their late 30s, 40s, or 50s, and I'm like, their conditioning is that much different than the other adults.
One of you want to talk about slide board real quick? Because I know that not everyone's familiar with slide board and slide board conditioning.
Yeah, so we still do slide. I didn't mention slide boards in the presentation because we've kind of changed the thought on, yes, as we mentioned, everything is conditioning, but generally we kind of think about slide boarding as not as something as specific as running a shuttle or doing a 2010 on the assault at a specific.
Your heart rate doesn't get as high.
Yeah, at a specific speed. So really what we're using slide boards as is kind of the same idea as what we would do any strength or any kind of pre-habby exercise for. Yes, you can get some movement out of the sagittal plane, which we know plenty of people need because all they do is run in straight lines all day. And you can get some direct tissue work to ab and adductors that can prepare people for change of directions and a lot of change of directions. So yes, there is, we still do slide boards twice a week, especially let's say the first 6 weeks of off-season training. As athletes start to get into, whether they're hockey players and they start to skate more often, or they're athletes who are now performing a lot of change of directions, we do dial that back to practically zero because you can get into overuse problems and sore groins and pulled groins and stuff like that. But there's definitely utility, very good utility for adding slide boards in. We just don't program them as conditioning.
Okay, Sean asks, final question. Like, we have come to find out that there's such thing as strong enough. Can the same thing be said for conditioning? I'll take first stab. So yes, I believe so. So if I use the example of you have a baseball pitcher, you have, we'll say, a basketball player, and then you have someone who runs the mile for competition, or in the Olympics, they want to run the mile. They're each going to have how much conditioning is conditioning enough? Like, how much conditioning do you need to be a baseball pitcher? How much conditioning do you need to be a basketball player? And how much conditioning do you need to run the mile? Like, you better practice running the mile, and you better do the mile so that you get better at running the mile. But is running the mile the right thing for a basketball player who's going to do lots of starts and stops and turns and twists and single leg jumps and double leg jumps? I would say, no, I don't want my basketball players running the mile. And is running the mile worth it for a baseball pitcher who's going to throw 90 pitches over a 2.5 hour period with lots of breaks? Like, I don't know. So you could make the case that running the mile or running in general gets you in better shape. So yeah, you're in better shape, but shape for what, right? You're not in better shape to pitch a baseball if you throw a 70-mile-per-hour pitch and you're 40 pounds overweight, but you can run a mile. Like, that's not going to make you a better baseball pitcher. That just means you can run a mile in a decent time. Same thing with a basketball player. Like, great, you can run a mile, but if you're not tall enough and you don't jump high enough and you don't have good dribbling skills, like, so what I'm saying is you'd be better off spending the time that you spent running the mile trying to get in shape by doing other things that are geared more towards either filling buckets or improving the skill of the athlete. So we got to put skills in here too, because if you suck at playing basketball, like, you could be in the best shape in the world, you still suck at playing basketball. If you can't pitch a baseball and you don't throw very fast, it doesn't matter how good of shape you're in or how much you can bench press. So yes, I think there's how strong is strong enough, and then how conditioned is conditioned enough.
And I think, like, and if we're answering this not as nuanced as Brandon just did, but just on face value, yeah, like, it's the same, like you said, it's the same thing as strong enough. It's all about analyzing the athlete in front of you and deciding what they need to be the best athlete. And if that person's conditioning bucket is full, then that person's conditioning bucket is full. Dedicate your time training that athlete to doing something better for them. And it's kind of what you can say about anything.
Right. And what might be a better way to think about it is, like, each person's conditioning bucket is a different size. So if you're a triathlete, your conditioning bucket is huge. If you're a golfer or a pitcher, your conditioning bucket is small, but it can still be empty. It can still be overflowed. So you still got to keep it at the right level. But how much or how big that bucket is changes for each individual. Anything else to add, gentlemen?
That's great.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send everyone this recording. I'll send everyone the slides and then the books that we talked about. And there's a couple extra articles too.
Yeah, someone asked about
templates? Sorry.
You what?
I was going to say, do either of you have any templates we can send, or maybe and where I could find some to put in here?
Someone had asked me about
I
the
can
study
send
about
you-
the subjective questionnaires, and I already found it, so I'll send that over.
Okay.
Do you want me to give you, like, last summer's, like, conditioning page, Excel sheet page?
Yeah, that would
Okay.
be, because I know we talked a lot about theory and buckets, and I know that a lot of people on this call will want to see, like, actual protocols, which I totally understand. So how do we actually program it? Because we brushed over it, but we didn't. That's not exactly what we did today. So.
And I think you could send them that sheet that you pulled up too. It might be a little different, but I mean, in general, the principles are the same.
Right. All right.
I'll
Well,
send you that page, yeah.
cool. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Next Monday we have next Monday we have functional anatomy.
Ooh.
I've been putting together slides for that one. It'll be good.
Good, because I don't have any slides for that. So
All right, sounds good.
after I see yours, I'll
All
find
right, see
something
ya.
in my book.
Bye, guys.
Buy my DVD.
See you guys.
Later. Thanks, guys.
you.